Several of you here today have been discussing, collaborating, arguing with Jeff Pullum since the 1970s. You'll be well aware of his career trajectory and the unusual breadth of his contributions. But the highlights alone may be known to some of the young things present, us under 70s. And after all, old men forget, yet all shall be forgot. But he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. So I shall be spurring remembrance and maybe checking some advantages. Jeff submitted his thesis to University College London in June 1976 for the PhD in general linguistics. In the acknowledgements, he notes that he took his first linguistics courses at York in 1968. He was 23. He had left his music career behind. He emphasizes the importance to him of his year at Cambridge in 1973-4, capped by what he calls, quote, the most rewarding 8 weeks of my life at the Linguistic Institute in 1974 on the campus of the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He then began work on his thesis at UCL, producing its 429 pages in 2 years. PhD candidates take heed. In 1979, it was published by Garland in its series, Outstanding Dissertations in Linguistics. This is the version most of us know. And its preface, dated September the 1st, 1978, that's 45 years ago tomorrow, says it has essentially the same form as the original. It then details the cuts made because, quote, the speculative material in these sections did not contribute substantially to the content of the thesis, end quote. Alarm bells, if the changes were insignificant, he wouldn't have mentioned them. And the cuts do show indications of progress over those 2 intervening years. So the original says this. Now, as the author is here, I'm going to ask him to read the quotations from his work, also so that we will have them recorded for posterity in the Vox Ipsissima.
This thesis reports research conducted within the general framework of assumptions that characterizes transformational generative grammar.
Now, this is gone in 1979, where the new additions include this remark concerning Chomsky's conditions on transformations and subsequent work.
My specific criticisms of Chomsky's recent assumptions in conditions on transformations constitute an exception to a general attempt throughout the thesis to maintain an agnostic position on many questions that surround issues I discuss. I avoid committing myself to particular background claims. For example, the generative semantics claim that initial phrase structures and semantic representations are identical for all sentences.
We see here the just barely perceptible beginnings of a driving theme in Jeff's career, the attempt to hold Noam Chomsky accountable for sloppiness, overgeneralization, and apparent dishonesty. This is still quite a mild distancing, and in 1976 he may have been advised to be cautious of his examiner's reactions. Remember that the preface is dated 1st of September 1978, so this paragraph will have been written by that date. The next 7 months will be critical. But backing up a few years and following my trajectory, I took my first undergraduate linguistics courses at Michigan in 1975. And the syntax course was utterly dogmatic. Since I was doing Romance languages, I was particularly interested in Kane's book, but I thought it paradoxical that Chomskyans would sanction a generative grammar of a specific language, whilst insisting that only universal grammar was a worthy object of scientific study. Someone tried to explain to me that Kane's French syntax is universalist in terms of components, phrase structure rules, and the transformations available. Kane wasn't inventing ad hoc transformations, generative semantic style, but something has to account for the syntactic differences, and the ordering of transformations is a means of doing that. Across the Atlantic, young Jeffrey was writing his thesis and addressing a version of the paradox I perceived. He makes this clear early on.
The true empirical issue in connection with rule ordering is the issue of whether orderings may be imposed on rules on a language-specific basis. In other words, grammars of two possible human languages differ with respect to the ordering imposed on identically formulated pairs of rules. This is a question which, as far as I know, Chomsky has never mentioned.
To clarify the terminology, he says,
Let me introduce the term parochial ordering constraint and the term universal ordering constraint for a restriction on sequencing of rule applications that is not particular to any grammar, but is part of the definition provided by linguistic theory of the notion possible grammar.
parochial means language specific and replaces Chomsky's extrinsic order, whilst universal replaces his intrinsic order. Pullum, the thesis argues that the Chomskyan distinction is, quote, incoherent. Kane's book supplies Pullum with 8 examples of the ordering of transformations in French, which in Jeff's words, Kane, quote, cites as particularly relevant to the question of the standard view that transformations are linearly ordered, end quote. Jeff lists these as cases A to H. Then he sets aside C to F as involving rules which Kane identifies as cyclic or post-cyclic. He then goes through the 4 remaining cases, showing how each can be explained by, quote, appeal to a global condition and to direct reference to grammatical relations rather than constituent structure, end quote. Again, the young things may need some glossing here. In the 1970s, global condition was fighting words. Pullum concludes this section thus, author.
I conjecture, therefore, cases B and H fall in with the other 6 cases from Kane's book that I've discussed, lending no support at all to the claim that parochial ordering restrictions are necessary or appropriate in syntactic descriptions. To put it another way, I suggest that the denial of parochial ordering constraints and the adoption of certain principles of relational grammar are pointing in the same direction here, and that direction looks to me not like a dead end, but like a promising new trail.
Relational grammar, too, was fighting words, by the way. Broadening out from his observations on Kane, he makes his strong theoretical claim in answer to what he has identified as, quote, the true empirical issue in connection with rule ordering, the issue of whether orderings may be imposed on rules on a language-specific basis. The answer is a firm no, with an equally firm insistence that the result is an enormous, quote, an enormously strengthened theory. Author.
Hardly a shred of evidence has been presented to justify the recourse to parochial ordering constraints that has constantly been had in standard transformational studies. An enormously strengthened theory is obtained if parochial ordering is completely forbidden. And in all the cases I've examined, there's hardly any question but that this is fully compatible with what's currently known about the form optimal syntactic descriptions should take.
And this is surely right in terms of a theory of universal grammar. Anything parochial that's part of the theory itself is an Achilles heel. Jeff takes from Koutsoudas, 1973, the UDRA, the hypothesis of universally determined rule application. And this is Jeff's gloss of it. All restrictions on the application of rules are determined by universal principles. In the 1979A introduction, he laments that
I would very much have wished to have access to the application ordering rules by Andreas Koutsoudas, but it was not available.
His review of that book appeared in March 1979, and from the first paragraph, we no longer sense the struggle to, quote, maintain an agnostic position he wrote about in the summer of 1978 in the introduction to the Garland edition of his thesis. I trust that no one any longer needs me to identify which words of Pullum's are doing the fighting. Quote, as is well known, and next, quote, TG suffers from a vitiating lack of explanatory force because it's so powerful. Hang on, TG was built on the foundation of explanatory adequacy rather than observational or descriptive adequacy, aka butterfly collecting. Cook, 1974, had made it clear how explanatory adequacy is bound up with universals in TG. Powerful had by now become a technical term for generativists, the opposite of constrained, in terms of whether the grammar generates or overgenerates possible strings. The review goes on to say, author,
I do not believe it has been fully recognized how extreme is the excessive power introduced in the TG theory by the availability of parochial ordering constraints.
We haven't rehearsed this, by the way. Another word toward the start of the 1979 B review is striking. Crazy is not a word to be found in Jeff's thesis, except in the data sentence, it would be crazy for Maximilian to bathe in hot yogurt. It sounds good to me, but anyway, nor is this the rhetoric of his early articles. A book review, however, offers a less formal context if the reviewer chooses to make it so and the editor allows it. We see developing a distinctive mode of Pullum style that he actually names in the title of his 1991 book, The Great Eskimo Vocabulary Hoax and Other Irreverent Essays, Irreverent. That marks out a unique position for him, flowering first in his commentary pieces in natural language and linguistic theory, from which those irreverent essays came, then on language log and other blogs. His deadpan disembowelments in lively farcical style saved the sanity of many early career linguists like me as we strove to survive the generativist reign of terror. That's only a slight exaggeration, and it's not entirely over, as Jeff documents in a recent paper on the reception of the work of Dan Everett, which I'll address further on. Regarding the style, there's another fleeting glimpse of it in his early work. The last sentence of the 1976 doctoral thesis reads, and now for something completely different. If you're young, a young person, ask the oldest person near you for the significance of that. Lamentably, that sentence was dropped from 1979A, and only when I read the original recently did I realize that just irreverent style is very Monty Python-esque, Cambridge footlights humor as distinct from the schoolboy antics of the generative semanticist. I should perhaps change my reign of terror metaphor to the Spanish Inquisition, though actually in those days we were all expecting the Spanish Inquisition. The something completely different didn't follow immediately from the 1976 thesis, as we've seen from his March 1979 review of Kutsudas. Jeff was essentially progressing along the same track, but the very next month, to quote another Jeffrey, one that April with his shoulders so to the drochte march hath pierced to the road, than longen folk to go on pilgrimages. Our Jeffrey's track changed dramatically when he read a paper by Gerald Gazdar, unpublished to this day, entitled English as a Context-Free Language. In his thesis, Jeff had dismissed the idea of a context-free transformational grammar with a target who's surprising in hindsight, Rodney Huddleston. Jeff writes that in his 1976 An Introduction to English Transformational Syntax.
Yeah, I'm not going to read out a critique of Huddleston.
All right, Huddleston proceeds to show how if the base is restricted to context-free phrase structure rules, the restrictions that ordering of base rules would contribute have no place. He then turns to transformations. So this is a quote from Huddleston. Let us now apply these notions to transformational rules. Here there is a strong case for including in the theory the extra power provided by extrinsic ordering. In other words, parochial ordering. Back to Jeff, it is my claim that there is no case at all for this increase in expressive power of the theory. Huddleston has in fact provided no motivation whatever for his espousal of parochial ordering in syntax. What Gazdar was envisioning, however, was, of course, as you know, a context-free, non-transformational grammar. Well, timing is everything. When in 1963, Gilbert Harman published a very similar proposal in his Generative Grammars Without Transformation Rules, the world was in love with transformations and the magic they performed. Doing away with them then felt madly retrogressive. Besides, who in those days could resist the clanging rhetoric of Noam Chomsky, who drummed out Harman's proposal, as this is from a footnote in Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, quote, as an extreme, quote, an extreme example of terminological equivocation, erroneously raising an issue of no conceivable importance. Quote. By 1979, that rhetoric had grown somewhat wearisome, if not erroneous, to a generation of linguists who'd grown up worrying and arguing about transformations. A plurality had come to feel that the arguments and worries were wasteful, so the thought of looking beyond transformations to the vast multiplicity of issues in syntax, many of which had yet to be described, let alone explained, captured the imagination of a few of those linguists. One of them was named Jeffrey K. Pullum. From this point forward, Jeff has charted his progress in a series of papers with sections of a historical nature. The preface to Gazdar and Pullum 1982 outlines the steps leading from Montague's semantics to Gazdar 1979, and then to Gazdar 1981, which was the first publication on these lines in the journal Literature. Gazdar and Pullum say in the 1982 that the pre-1981 papers are, quote, obsolete and should no longer be regarded as citable references. They note that the term generalized phrase structure grammar, quote, was adopted in the summer of 1980 during the Roundtable Conference on Auxiliaries in Groningen, Holland, where, quote, Aaron Bach gave a paper about what he was calling generalized categorical grammar. Bach's adjective was promptly borrowed by Gazdar, Klein, Pullum, and Sag in order to forestall a growing tendency for people to employ the unpleasantly alliterative and attributionally incorrect name Gazdar grammar. Generalized replaced the term context-free with some conceptual and methodological shift. So syntactic categories have internal structure in the way that phonemes are structured from distinctive features, and, quote, a metagrammar captures generalizations not expressed by the phrase structure rules themselves. Gazdar et al. 1985 take generative grammar to include GPSG, LFG, and Chomsky's syntactic structures, but, quote, little of the research done under the rubric of the government binding framework, since there are very few signs of any commitment to the explicit specification of grammar as a theoretical principles in this genre of linguistics, end quote, touche. I shall not pursue the subsequent developments of Jeff's work in grammatical theory, which have been quite well covered by other papers on our program today, except for one which I cannot resist. His 1983 paper, How Many Possible Human Languages Are There? Obviously a direct challenge to the foundational Chomskyan position that there are only a finite number. Pullum looks at this finiteness thesis, as he calls it, through the lens of various versions of generative theory, and he concludes that it's baseless. Now, the backstory to this is recounted in his forthcoming paper, Daniel Pirahan Syntax, author.
In a lecture on constituents order typology, I presented arguments that there was no convincing evidence for any language in the world having an object initial basic constituent order, OBS or OSB. The only surface orders for the major constituents of the clause permitted by universal grammar seem to be SOV as in Hindi, SVO as in English, VSO as in Irish, and VOS as in Malagasy.
I should have mentioned this was a lecture he gave in 1976 at UCL. In the back row of the lecture hall, a man raised his hand, quote, and said that he had been working on a language that he believed strongly preferred OVS as the order in transitive clauses. This was Desmond Derbyshire, an SIL missionary whose UCL PhD thesis Jeff had been assigned to supervise. Derbyshire had no university degree, but did have 20 years experience working on a Caribbean language of northern Amazonia, Hishkariana. He persuaded his initially dubious supervisor that the basic word order of the language is indeed strict OVS. Derbyshire's grammar of Hishkariana earned him his PhD and was published in 1977 in a revised version as the first volume in the Lingua Descriptive series founded by Bernard Comrie and Norval Smith in order to facilitate comparative study by linguists of the languages covered in this series, Comrie and Smith devised the Lingua Descriptive Series Questionnaire, which specified topics to be covered in each book and how they should be ordered. When in 1984, Derbyshire and Pullum undertook to compile the 4-volume Handbook of Amazonian Languages, they adopted the Lingua Questionnaire, and they recruited the young SIL missionary Dan Everett to write the description of Pirahan. In his forthcoming paper, Jeff expresses regret for having made Everett follow the Lingua Questionnaire, as it appears to have led to his informants producing certain utterances that aren't really Pirahan, perhaps in a desire experienced by many anthropologists to please the kind foreigner who is so intently interested in them. Years later, those inimical to Everett, because of his powerful evidence that Pirahan lacks recursion, the last bit still standing of Chomsky's universal grammar, they would point precisely to these bits of Everett's data in order to discredit him. Jeff doesn't disguise his contempt for the anti-intellectual nature of the attacks on Everett. Throughout the œuvre pullumienne is found a methodological rigor so deeply ingrained that no one whose writing he critiques can get away with sneaky little shortcuts, let alone out-and-out dishonesty. That's not to say that Jeff's approach lacks argumentative strategy and tactical nous, far from it. In the published doctoral thesis, he says, quote,
I feel that where it's possible, claims about rule interaction or other issues in linguistics should be substantiated or refuted on ground chosen by the opponents of the view being argued for. For example, in the case of the treatment of modals and other auxiliary verbs as ordinary main verbs in initial structures, it's clearly the generative semantics defenders who will be most ready to accept the claim. For that reason, Deirdre Wilson and I attempted in our paper to show that the claim could be convincingly argued for in terms of autonomous syntax assumptions, that is, on the ground chosen by those who had generally rejected or ignored the main verb analysis.
That is strategy deployed in the interest of honest debate and not guaranteeing a win. You may be wondering whether Jeff ever patched things up with Rodney Huddleston, who, as it happens, did his PhD here in our applied linguistics program under Halliday. In 1998, Jeff and Arnold Zwicky contributed a paper to Huddleston's Festschrift, and then in 2002 appeared the Huddleston Pullum et al. Cambridge Grammar of the English Language. And I wonder whether, in 2123, people looking back at the whole period of linguistics from the mid-20th century on won't point to this as one of its most significant achievements, alongside the Handbook of Amazonian Languages. Both can be seen as bound up with Pullum's progress, from the doctoral student arguing against any parochial ordering of rules to the proponent of flat-structured GPSG and its progeny. All this was buttressed by groundbreaking work in computational linguistics and the philosophy of language, much of it written in collaboration with the greatly missed Barbara Scholes. There is, of course, much more, so very much more. I'll limit myself to one last recent step in Pullum's progress, for which he credits me with playing a role. You're probably aware that Jeff's greatest public fame, aside from the Ram Jam Band, lies with his skewering of prescriptive grammarians, in particular because the rules which they prescribe are aimed at utterances which many, if not most, native speakers produce naturally, but which, for one reason or another, a grammarian deems incorrect. This goes back to some of Jeff's earliest publications, notably his 1974 article, Loth's Grammar of Evaluation. Bishop Loth is famous for having codified the rule against ending a sentence with a preposition and remarking that this, quote, is an idiom that our language is strongly inclined to, end quote. I wrote my own PhD thesis on language standardization, looking at its development over modern times across the Romance languages and beyond, and how prescriptivism functions in terms of social power in both negative and positive ways. I happened to start it just when what's known as the Black English trial got underway in Ann Arbor, and I witnessed how the linguistic discrimination case launched by the parents of African American children against the school board was one based very much on the testimony of Lebove, who persuaded the court that Black English, or AAVE, there's currently no term for it that doesn't cause offense in some quarters, that it's a real language in its own right and not English spoken badly. Leboeuf did this by demonstrating its regular structure and crucially by showing that there are right and wrong ways of speaking Black English. Prescriptivism makes it a real language in the eyes of the law. In my 2020 paper, I argued against statements in Pullum 2004 to the effect that the constitutive rules which syntacticians discover are different in kind from the regulative rules that prescriptivists deal in. I tried to show that the distinction isn't black and white. In particular, that constitutive rules do have a regulative side, and that regulative rules, prescriptive rules, even as codified in Jeff's Bête Noire, Strunk and White's The Elements of Style, that they've aided countless numbers of people to raise themselves up in the socioeconomic hierarchy. People who, like me, didn't grow up in a family that spoke standard English. Some of you may recall my presenting the paper here with Jeff chairing and, shall we say, not obviously accepting my argument. But in the recent Routledge Handbook of Linguistic Prescriptivism, you'll find the opening chapter by Jeffrey K. Pullum entitled Why Grammars Have to Be Normative and Prescriptivists Have to Be Scientific. In it, we read,
factual hallucination, elitist content, and reformist dreams are not necessary concomitants of works with a prescriptive motivation. And once we put all three of those aside, it becomes clear that prescriptive works can be very useful to anyone who produces writing that's intended for others to read.
He recognizes that most of those opening to his chapter and the expectation of the ritual vivisection of prescriptivists will be taken aback.
At this point, readers acquainted with some of my earlier work might begin to wonder whether this is really me or some other Jeff Pullum. Do my supportive remarks about prescriptivists and my apparently relativist recognition of different cultures signal a retrenchment? For am I not the same Jeff Pullum who summarized the contribution of that much-loved booklet, The Elements of Style, as 50 years of stupid grammar advice? I am indeed that same Pullum, and no, I have not changed my mind.
However,
the tendency of modern linguists to decry the efforts of prescriptive writers, sight unseen, has created a putative rivalry that serves no good purpose. It encourages the counterposed stereotypes under which usage advice writers are depicted as blinkered fools or malign elitists, while linguists are caricatured as anything-goes liberals who believe there are no grammatical restraints at all. The community of scholars studying English grammar is not well served by being divided into two hostile factions constantly caricaturing and insulting each other.
Once more hath he arrived at the desired country. I confess I was confused by a footnote in this chapter which refers to the UDHR. What? I wondered, has he reverted to worrying about Koutsouras' universally determined rule application? No, that's UDRA. This was a comment about the normative nature of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Whew. Rest assured, Pullum's progress is never retrograde. Long may it continue. Thank you. You may address questions to either of us. I also want to thank Caroline Haycock for some advice on this paper, as well as Randy Allen Harris.
How long did it take you to put that together?
Put what together?
You didn't have a lot of time, and yet this is amazing.
My team of writers. Thank you. Yes.
I have a question for you as a
Yeah.
scholar of Pullum. A difficult counterfactual. Suppose that his education had begun at MIT, right in the belly of the beast. Chomsky as an advisor. We know that he was influenced by the 1974 Institute, which was full of Chomskyans and all sorts of exciting things happening, and that was energizing. Would we have a different body of scholarship from Pullum in that world, or would he have found his way back to the same position?
Well, I think a lot of people will be able to answer that, but I would just like to take a slightly circuitous route and say that the answer may lie with Joan Mailing, who actually was there, did start there, but and was originally planning to do syntax, but as I recall, you then, because you were drawn to Morris Halle as a supervisor, decided to go into phonology. And maybe he would have done the same.
That's only partially accurate, yes.
Okay.
I was at MIT between 1968 and so February '73, so a little over 4 years. And initially, like so many other students, wanted to have Noam Chomsky as my advisor and whatever, but it was also the heyday of the generative semantics wars, and I watched plenty of dissertation defenses that I didn't want to be a part of, watching the arrows fly over, sometimes over, hopefully over the student's head. And I ended up writing a dissertation on classical Arabic metrics as a way of escaping the wars, until I got back a few years later to what I was really interested in, which was syntax.
I would just say that, remember that line from the third one here. This thesis reports research conducted within the general framework of assumptions that characterizes transformational generative grammar. So
susceptible then, and in the right environment, maybe a diehard Chomskyan to this day.
does anyone have, no, you're saying no, Peter Kolkowitz. What do you think?
And my own personal experience, of course this is not about me, is that if you think it through, you'll end up where Jeff is, no matter where you start.
Yeah. Do you have an opinion?
Opinion on my own.
I was enjoying acting as though we were just scholars trying to understand Pullum from afar.
It's true.
Without Pullum to consult.
Yeah. Aren't you confusing the subject and the object here?
Sorry, it's true.
And you're meant to be interpreting my life.
Yes, quite. All right.
My
So,
reply comes later.
after a couple of glasses of wine, we'll ask him again.
Well, I reckon.
Yes. What do you reckon?
So yeah, I think we would have the same Pullum. And it is noteworthy though that many people who are known to be MIT trained iconoclasts, people who left the fold, like Sog and Resnick, did that, but in more cautious ways. And the theories that they developed did end up staying much closer to the Chomskyan ideal in many kind of general philosophical points that influence the kind of description that you get than Jeff has. And so I think that it's probably helpful that he was doing this work from afar, but also helpful that it was Jeff.
It's worth remembering that University College London, with Neil Smith and Deirdre Wilson as the leading lights, was unquestionably a transformational generative grammar department led by those two who were admirers of Chomsky to an extreme degree, as you learn from Neil Smith's book, Chomsky, Ideas and Ideals or something. Over the top Chomsky admiration. They were good friends of mine, but I began to disagree with them. But during those early years, 1974 to 76, I was writing a dissertation that had as a function. Somehow I had discerned that a dissertation was more like an application for a union card. It wasn't meant to be the ultimate truth about everything I've thought during my long career. I had 2 years to do this, turned it in, and with the loose residence requirements of London, 2 years was enough. I was employed as a lecturer at the same time. Neil Smith was happy to sign off on it, so I got the PhD, mission accomplished, and then began thinking about syntax and more. So to that extent, it was a little bit like Joan Mailing's experience. Get your dissertation done, get out of there, then start writing some of what you really think and developing that. And it may end up very, very different.
Fortunately, our PhD students don't need to do that. But I'm not a syntactician, but I can tell you an anecdote. Other people here will have more shit that they show at dinner. But you said that with John Bresnan that it was a milder thing. But I was at the LSA conference in I'm not sure 1978 or 79, and in a room absolutely full. I don't remember who was giving the talk. But then the next person to come up was John Bresnan. And Morris Haller stood up to walk out, quite theatrically, and everybody followed him out of the lecture hall except for Jim McCauley. Jim McCauley and I were the only two left in the room. So
Gallus Glaswegian.
yes, it's true. And I wasn't even Scottish yet. But so I don't think it was perceived as so gentle. I don't know, but others will know much more about this than I.
Anything about it was gentle.
Yeah.
Except insofar as you still see the hallmarks of the generative in their work in the way.
Yeah,
really
but the
comes-
reception wasn't
Yeah.
necessarily any
Oh,
better
no,
for that reason.
that sounds, yeah, but I had no illusions that was a
Right.
frustrating thing.
The Neil Smith and Neil and Junior point has an Edinburgh connection in a curious way. That where are we? About 8 years later, the then Social Science Research Council asked for proposals for a very large-scale interdisciplinary research center to be funded, bringing together computation and linguistics and psychology. And it was pretty clear that Neil and Junior thought that this had their name on it. But with Jim Herford and Ellen Bart from here and myself from AI, people from Glasgow on the psychology side, we actually got the Human Communication Research Center funding. And I think it's not trivially important that it was because we weren't committed to a Chomskyan paradigm. And we're much more, therefore able, I think, to be slightly more sincere about saying, we really want to work with the psychologists.
Right, yeah.
And John Labour was.
John, yes, I'm sorry, I should not have omitted John's name.
Who sadly died during the COVID thing, and we never really had any chance to recognize that.
Okay, thank you, John.
All right, thanks.